Lutcher, Louisiana, May 13th, 1917. Dear Sir, I have been reading the Chicago Defender and seeing so many advertisements about the work in the North, I thought to write you concerning my condition. I am working hard in the South and can hardly earn a living. I have a wife and one child and can hardly feed them. I thought to write and ask you for some information concerning how to get a pass for myself and family. I was out in town today talking to some of the men, and they say if they can get passes that 30 or 40 of them would come. But they haven't got the money, and they don't know how to come. But they are good, strong, and able working men. If you will instruct me, I will instruct the other men how to come as they all want to work. Please don't publish this because we have to whisper this around among ourselves because the white folks are angry now because Negroes are going north. This letter was sent to the Chicago Defender, one of America's most important black newspapers. For years, the Chicago Defender described opportunities available to African Americans in northern cities, factory jobs, schools, and housing. To Southern blacks trapped in sharecropping, locked into segregation, and terrorized by lynching, the North was a promised land. During World War I, thousands of African Americans took trains to northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York to help make weapons for the war. Some moved to southern cities like Atlanta or Birmingham. In 1870, 80% of the black population lived in the rural South. By 1970, the reverse was true. 80% of the black population lived in the urban North. It was one of the most dramatic demographic shifts in history, called the Great Migration. W.E.B. Du Bois encouraged African Americans to enlist in the army to help the Allies win the war in Europe. In his newspaper, The Crisis, he advised his readers to close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens. He hoped their loyalty would be repaid with greater rights at home, similar to what happened during the Civil War. African Americans fought bravely in the war, as they have in every war before and since, but Du Bois ended up regretting his advice. That's because another war would be much more decisive for America's future, the Culture War. Du Bois wasn't the only one dispensing advice during the war. In 1915, Teddy Roosevelt gave some advice to the new immigrants in the Knights of Columbus. The one absolutely certain way of bringing this nation to ruin would be to permit it to become a tangle of squabbling nationalities, an intricate knot of German Americans, Irish Americans, English Americans, French Americans, Scandinavian Americans, or Italian Americans, each preserving its separate nationality, each at heart feeling more sympathy with Europeans of that nationality than with the other citizens of the American Republic. The men who do not become Americans and nothing else are hyphenated Americans, and there ought to be no room for them in this country. Roosevelt's words might sound harsh, but he meant it as friendly advice. As we have seen, there was a lot of mistrust of immigrants during the war. They were frequently harassed, arrested, and deported. Roosevelt was giving them the key to stop this: become American. Make it impossible for anyone to categorize them as an immigrant. Escape their racialization. In other words, become white. This was easier said than done, since most immigrants weren't familiar with America's racial categories before they arrived. They would have to learn through experience. Finding a place to live was an education in and of itself. They would most likely only be able to afford rent in one of the overcrowded immigrant neighborhoods in the cities. They lived around other immigrants from across Europe, but usually interacted with people from their home country due to language and culture. If they went to church, they tried to find one with services in their home language. In these circumstances, it was tough for them to follow Roosevelt's advice to become American. There was one way the big cities were uniquely American, though: anti-black racism. African Americans couldn't live in most parts of the city. Landlords often made agreements with each other, called housing covenants, promising not to rent or sell to them under the assumption that black residents brought down property values. Only certain areas were open to black settlement, like Chicago's South Side or New York City's Harlem, and their rents were higher. Immigrants would have noticed this. They also might have noticed that very few of their fellow factory workers were black. If the factory workers went out on strike, employers often brought in workers to replace them, called scabs. It was common for African Americans to be used as scabs, and just as common for striking workers to threaten them for doing so. In these situations, the immigrants might have heard the N-word for the first time. In fact, It was a running joke that was usually the first English word immigrants learned. Entertainment also taught anti-black racism. Advertising was full of racist tropes, like the Gold Dust Twins or Aunt Jemima. Amusement parks had games like Hit the N-Word. Stage shows and, later, movies had minstrel characters who dressed in blackface and caricatured the supposed mannerisms of African Americans. It was tough for immigrants not to learn from these things. Statistics suggest that new immigrants bought homes at higher rates than anyone else. Immigrants associated home ownership with security, perhaps because so many of them had been kicked off their lands in Europe. Many immigrants overworked and underfed themselves just to save enough money to buy a home. This was before the stereotype of the American dream of home ownership even existed, which means we should probably call it the immigrant dream instead. And when they became homeowners, they were often required to participate in the same racist housing covenants as other landlords. As the years went by, new neighborhoods developed filled with new immigrants, but no black people. Catholic immigrants in these neighborhoods often found their churches full of Catholics from all over Europe, like Italians and Poles. The priest would most likely be Irish, since they were the oldest Catholic immigrant group. Again, no African Americans, because most of them were Protestant. At the very least, these experiences taught new immigrants that black people were something separate from them. The new immigrants may not have been white, but they certainly weren't black. They were something in between. But what about their children? If they attended public school, chances are they received a thoroughly waspy Protestant-coded education. Polish, Russian, or Jewish kids learned about King James and George Washington, not people from their home countries. The one exception might have been the Italian Christopher Columbus, who was mostly taught as the guy who discovered America, which is Big Cat. They were taught waspy customs, like what to eat and when, how to wash up, how to sit at a table, how to dress, and the type of behavior expected of a respectable white kid in America. Home economics taught girls how to keep house, American style. It was common for kids who went to school to rebel against the traditional ways of their parents. The first movie with sound in American history, The Jazz Singer, is about an American Jewish boy turning away from the traditions of his father. The kids were showing their parents how to take Roosevelt's advice. They were showing them how to become American. World War I and the Red Scare put even more pressure on these families to adopt white ways. After all, they didn't want to be mistaken for a communist and find themselves deported. All of this is an overly simplified description of how new immigrants and their children eventually stopped being racialized. It's how they slowly went from being something in between black and white to being fully white. It was a long process that happened before, during, and after the culture wars of the 1920s. It shows us how the Stephen Millers and Greg Bovinos of the world are able to lay claim to whiteness today as children of immigrants. African American soldiers returned from the war in 1919 hopeful that their contributions would earn them respect at home. What they got instead was a summer of violence, called the Red Summer of 1919. Every major city, north, south, east, and west, saw racial violence during the Red Summer. In Chicago, much of the African American population had migrated over rail from the Mississippi Delta. Thanks to racist housing covenants, they were mostly crammed into the south side of the city. In the years leading up to World War I, over 20 black homes in Chicago were bombed. One of them killed a 6-year-old girl. Nobody was ever arrested for these crimes. But one thing was for certain. The bombers weren't communists. These were whites who were angry that some black families had started to migrate out of the South Side. Racial tension was already in the air by the summer of 1919. The only way to beat the heat in the summers back then was to go outside, especially to the beach. Chicago's beach was informally segregated, with 29th Street marking the dividing line between the black and white sections. On one July day, a group of black children floated on a raft over the line. Whites threw rocks at them, killing one of the children. When the police arrived, none of the whites were arrested, only a black man. Violence broke out on the beach, then spread into the neighborhoods. The city was 95% white, including the new immigrant population. Immigrant gangs came into black neighborhoods to attack people in restaurants and streetcars. An Irish gang called Reagan's Colts disguised themselves in blackface and went into Polish neighborhoods to burn down homes. They hoped the Polish immigrants would mistake them for black rioters and want revenge. Police were called out to restore order, then the National Guard. When it was all over, 38 people lay dead and 537 were seriously injured, mostly African Americans. Similar stories played out in cities across the country during the Red Summer of 1919. This was the opposite of what W.E.B. Du Bois hoped by encouraging African Americans to serve in the Army. The violence didn't stop with the Red Summer either. 1921 saw perhaps the most notorious violence in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Greenwood Avenue in Oklahoma was known as the Black Wall Street, a thriving community of black-owned businesses. On May 30th, a black boy named Dick Rowland was in an elevator with a white woman. The details are unclear, but the white woman made an accusation, and Dick Rowland was arrested. A white mob showed up to the courthouse where Rowland was being kept, presumably to lynch him. The black community arrived at the courthouse to defend him. Both crowds had rifles, since many of them were war veterans. Fighting broke out, and the outnumbered blacks retreated to Greenwood Avenue. Then, on the morning of June 1st, white mobs invaded Greenwood Avenue en masse and started burning it down. Black men used guns to protect their homes and businesses. The National Guard was called out to restore order, which they did by placing the black population in makeshift prisons, presumably for their own protection. When it was all over, the Black Wall Street was destroyed. Whites even commandeered airplanes to drop dynamite. As many as 300 people were killed, most of them black. For years, the city of Tulsa tried to hide the true extent of what became known as the Tulsa Race Massacre. Historians have only recently started piecing together what happened and the true extent of the cover-up that followed. Many of the details will probably never be known. The Tulsa Race Massacre and the Red Summer were loosely part of the culture war of the 1920s. But they connected to a much longer history of blacks facing white violence anytime they dared to live the American dream, like moving out of their segregated neighborhoods or opening up businesses. Despite all that, any type of culture war in American history can always be connected back to black people, since black people are the heart and soul of American culture. We mentioned earlier how the jazz singer was about a boy who was torn between American culture and the Jewish culture of his parents. Part of this was because he realized something many white children realize as they grow up in America. Black culture is pretty effing cool. The Jazz Singer was an appropriate movie for the jazz age, which is a title often given to the 1920s. Jazz has roots in Southern black culture, taking shape in New Orleans shortly before the war started. It was brought north with the Great Migration and took the country by storm when it reached Harlem. Harlem, like Chicago's South Side, was a neighborhood born out of racist housing covenants. It was originally full of new immigrants, but they moved north or west into New Jersey. It became one of the only New York City neighborhoods whose landlords rented to African Americans, albeit at steep rents. The expensive rent led residents to throw rent parties in their homes. They charged admission for people to drink, which was lucrative during Prohibition, and dance, mostly to jazz music. A unique Harlem culture developed with jazz at the center of it. Word quickly spread that Harlem had the best party scene in the city. Whites took the train uptown to attend crowded dance halls, where people of all races drank and danced together to loud jazz. There was an attitude of acceptance. Racial and sexual barriers were overcome by the free flow of music and alcohol. Some clubs even catered to gay people, with one artist claiming nobody was in the closet. There wasn't any closet. Less adventurous white people attended the Cotton Club, where the famous Duke Ellington played. There, they paid big money to sit away from the black musicians and dancers. They were there to observe black culture without participating in it. This has become a pattern. Today, wealthy whites pay big money to live in Williamsburg and Brownsville to become New York City influencers, without actually interacting with people who live in New York City. At best, they're cultural observers and, at worst, appropriators. We see this play out in The Jazz Singer. Al Jolson's character is torn between the traditional singing of his Jewish parents and a more American style of singing. While it's not really jazz, there isn't any question that he borrows from African American culture. This helps explain why he performs in blackface. He uses blackness to help him claim independence from his father's expectations. The blackface in and of itself is offensive, but it's also what it represents. He doesn't show appreciation or understanding of black culture. Instead, he ransacks it for his own purposes. He uses the parts he can and throws the rest away. Like the patrons of the Cotton Club and the New York City influencers, he's a cultural tourist, someone with the privilege of returning to the world of whiteness at his convenience. The black writer Alan Locke gave voice to the people of Harlem who didn't have this privilege, who he called the New Negro. The war and the Great Migration led to what Locke called a spiritual emancipation among black people. He said the Negro problem was no longer exclusively or even predominantly Southern. Without the limitations of Jim Crow, black people were free to educate and express themselves in places like Harlem. Many of them had served in the war, where they experienced more freedom in Europe than they ever did back in America. What came out of this spiritual awakening was the Harlem Renaissance. For the 10 years between the end of the war and the stock market crash in 1929, black artists, poets, and writers produced a treasure trove of material. Most of it was optimistic about the possibilities for black culture now that it wasn't tethered to the South. They were free to say that black is beautiful and that black people had just as much a stake in America as any WASP. As we've seen, this pride and confidence was contagious. People like Al Jolson, who was still navigating between the path between Judaism and whiteness, looked to black culture for inspiration. As the poet Langston Hughes said, the Negro was in vogue. One Harlem resident took black pride even further, Marcus Garvey. He was born in Jamaica and moved to London for a time where he met black people from Britain's African colonies. This led him to the idea of Pan-Africanism, the idea that black people were one nation no matter where in the world they lived. His goal was to found a separate black country in Africa, one that would become a basis for political and economic independence. He moved to Harlem, where he established the Universal Negro Improvement Association to help make his dream of a black state a reality. The Harlem Renaissance was the perfect environment for his work. He organized elaborate parades where he dressed in military garb. The goal was to show black people that they had all the tools necessary to forge a great nation of their own. He started raising money through his Black Star Line steamship company to buy a fleet of ships to bring people to Africa. This led him to make some interesting connections, including members of the Ku Klux Klan, who wholeheartedly supported his quest to bring black people to Africa. Still, he was enormously popular. In 1920, he held a massive meeting in Madison Square Garden. 25,000 people showed up to declare Marcus Garvey the president of Africa. In the crowd was an agent of the Bureau of Investigation, the organization that would become the FBI later. J. Edgar Hoover took a special interest in Marcus Garvey. Any man who could fill Madison Square Garden with people pledging allegiance to him was a threat in Hoover's mind. His agents infiltrated the UNIA, where they found enough evidence to charge Garvey with mail fraud in the process of raising money for the Black Star Line Company. Hoover used these mail fraud charges as a pretext to deport him to Jamaica, and the UNIA fell apart. This wouldn't be the last black civil rights leader on Hoover's hit list. He spied on Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and went out of his way to destroy the Black Panther Party. In his words, the Black Panthers were the most dangerous group in America since they combined the two things he hated most: black people and communism. African Americans had their own lane during the culture wars of the 1920s, one that occasionally intersected with the wider culture wars. It was against blackness that new immigrants started to discover their whiteness. It was against the city streets of Chicago, Tulsa, and New York that black people rewrote the terms of their entire culture. World War I may not have won them more rights, but they won a newfound influence in America that became a source of pride and wisdom.